Here we have the 2022 Acura MDX A-Spec and the 2023 Hyundai Palisade in the Ultimate Calligraphy trim.
We've faced these vehicles off before here at Driving.ca, but the MDX has entered a new generation since then, and the Palisade is refreshed for the 2023 model year, so we thought it was time to face them off again and see which one comes out the winner.
Let's get in the cars. I'll take the Hyundai, you take the Acura.
Sounds good. So Renita, we have a very interesting comparison again here. Similar in scope to the first time we had these two vehicles together. The Palisade's in its upper trim where it's really quite luxurious despite being what most people would consider a mainstream brand. And then we have the Acura MDX, which is a entry-level-ish luxury brand, similar on price, off by a few $1,000s. Viewers, take a look at the screen to see the exact difference there. Very similar on all of the specs that will matter to a lot of people, but let's start where most people buying these vehicles will care the most, which is which one would you rather have parked in your driveway, Renita?
That's a hard question. I think they both have their own unique looks. I like the way the Palisade looks more. I'm not a huge fan of the MDX's long nose, if you will, but it's not a deal breaker. It's not ugly per se. I think I would prefer the Palisade on my driveway.
Interesting. The refresh on the Palisade, I really quite like what they've done with the lights. Less of a drastic C shape and more of a gentle vertical angle to it now. It looks quite good, and the grille has a nicer presence. I really am a big fan of the styling on this MDX though. It's maybe not groundbreaking, but I like Acura's current grille. I think it suits the profile of the MDX really well. What's interesting is I wouldn't have thought this unless I read the specs myself, but the MDX is a little bit larger, which it doesn't feel like when you're using it and driving it around.
If you saw them both on the road at separate times, it wouldn't look bigger than the Palisade.
And it feels a little bit smaller in its drive feel as well. Let's jump into driving dynamics, because that's another important differentiator with these two vehicles. So in the MDX, we have a 3.5 liter naturally aspirated V6, and the horsepower figure is very similar between the two of these. It's 290 in this and 291 in the Palisade, which has a 3.8 liter naturally aspirated engine, also a V6. So very similar on power. The torque figures are almost bang on as well. So check out the spec box again, viewers, if you want the exact figures on that. One of the bigger changes in this generation for the MDX is it's got a 10-speed automatic transmission, and that's as opposed to the 8-speed in the Palisade. The Palisade, by the way, in this refresh has no mechanical changes versus the previous half generation that came before it. So in the MDX, I find that even though it's got a naturally aspirated engine, that 10-speed automatic with nice short, low gears gets it up to speed really quickly. And it feels more energetic, I think, in initial acceleration than the Palisade does.
Yeah, I found drivability-wise, the MDX was quicker. It has a quicker pickup, but also the steering is a bit more loose than in the Palisade. And it's not a huge difference if you're driving them completely separately, but when you're driving them back to back, you can tell how much stiffer the Palisade is.
I completely agree with you, and that's the only thing I think that I would change about the MDX's drive feel. Where the MDX has another handling advantage, actually more than one handling advantage over the Palisade, is the suspension setup and the all-wheel drive setup. So the all-wheel drive system in the MDX is Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system, which has power-based torque vectoring, meaning that it will send power to the outside wheel in a turn to help you get around the turn a little bit more nimbly, and that's as opposed to the H-track all-wheel drive system in the Palisade, which uses a brake-based system where it will apply a gentle brake to the inside wheel to do the assist through the turns that way. And it's a subtle difference, but it's an important one, and I think it contributes a lot to the MDX feeling more like a car and a little bit more energetic in its handling than the Palisade does. The MDX also has double wishbone front suspension as opposed to the multi-link that's on the Palisade, and that helps as well. I think the last thing that's a big factor in handling is the MDX's ground clearance is 18.5 centimeters, and then the Palisade's is 20 centimeters. And while the 20 centimeters in the Palisade is probably closer to what people would want and expect in an SUV, if drive, feel, and handling matters a lot to you, then you're going to really appreciate the MDX and the fact that it's a little bit closer to the ground with a lower center of gravity, because it really does make a difference. So Renita, you've got 3 kids. How about you tell us about what it was like to use these 2 vehicles in your family life?
So I've driven both of them before. I think we both have. I love the MDX. Going into this comparison, I was really confused about which one I would like more because they both are, equally great family cars. The MDX in the second row has that middle seat that's so versatile. You can fold it down, use it as cup holders. You can flip it up and use it as an extra seat. You could also take it out entirely, and then you've got space to walk through the middle. In the Palisade, there's no middle seat in the second row, but there are 3 seats in the back, as opposed to the MDX's 2 seats in the back and 3 in the middle. I found that the Palisade was a bit easier family-friendly wise. There are some aspects about the inside that are easier to maneuver with kids around than in the MDX, but the MDX isn't horrible on the inside for families.
It's not horrible, especially if you're someone like me who, if I were to buy a 3-row SUV, I know I would use it occasionally because my kid has a lot of friends and there'd be times when we want to pile a lot of people in, but in my daily life, I wouldn't use the 3rd row constantly, and so it wouldn't bother me as much to have a 3rd row that was a little bit tighter and really only suited for occasional use, and because that 2nd row is, as you said, so versatile, and I would find that to be a bigger advantage. But somebody like you who is going to use that 3rd row on a regular basis, I think would benefit more from the Palisade's usability in that regard.
You're right, but in that sense, I will say that the good thing about that 2nd row in the MDX is that if you do have 3 kids like myself, I can still fit the 3 of them in that middle row, even though it's a bit of a squeeze. And then if I do need more cargo space, I can just flip down the back seats or the 50-50 split. But in here, I basically am forced to use the 3rd row because there's no middle seat up here. The Palisade does come with an optional bench seat, but I believe not in the Ultimate Calligraphy trim.
Right, so you'd be spending a little bit less anyway, but maybe that's not such a bad thing.
Yeah.
So let's look at some of the interior features. I love the interior design in the MDX with the layers of color. There's the dashboard has a really nice red stitching to it, and then a chrome colored layer underneath and some piano black, which might collect fingerprints, but it's done in a way that's really subtle. Ambient lighting is a really nice touch that stands out at night. Yeah, just overall I think it's a very, very sharp design.
Yeah, I do like the way the MDX looks. I don't hate the Palisade's looks on the inside, but it's got a lot going on. There's a bit of like suede on the top. There's some leather inserts in the middle. There's what looks like a screen on the side beside the digital cluster, but it doesn't do anything. It's just sort of black glass that really just attracts dust or fingerprints, and there's no point to it. The Palisade has a ergo motion seat. I didn't realize that it did. It's kind of like a massage, but not exactly like a massage.
Yeah, it's sort of to keep your body mobile when you're on long drives.
There's a function that's set within the vehicle settings to come on automatically after 30 minutes. And so at 30 minutes, I started feeling like a press in my back, which is okay, but you have the seat set to your specific settings. So feeling like that lumbar support go back in when I wasn't like expecting it, that was kind of weird. But it's a setting in vehicle settings, so you can just turn it off if you don't like it.
Where I will give the Palisade kudos for interior is they pay a lot of attention to the touch points, all of the touch points, and what it's going to feel like for you to interact with the car on a daily basis. That suede headliner, as much as, like you said, some people might not love it, it extends into the visors as well, and so when you reach up to touch the visor, it feels really nice, whereas the one in the MDX here, it just feels like a cheap fabric, right? That kind of attention to detail is worth kudos. It's important to somebody who's spending this much on a vehicle. Let's jump into the infotainment because there are some really important distinctions between these two. So what's going on in the MDX here is this touchpad. I think Acura is finally getting rid of the touchpad. I think the new Integra doesn't have it, and my sense is that they know that we don't like it, and eventually we'll see it start to disappear. But for now, if you're buying the MDX, you're living with this touchpad, and it's just not nice to use in general. I have found that there is one advantage to it, which is that when you're in Apple CarPlay, which is wireless by the way, as well as Android Auto, it will actually let you use the touchpad to interact with things like using the search function in the navigation. So as much as you're there swiping through all the letters to spell the address, you can actually use it, whereas you can't in a lot of vehicles these days because you have to actually interact with the touchscreen and it'll shut it down when you're driving. So that's a bonus, but it's set up so that you're supposed to be able to touch your finger to the place on the screen that corresponds to where the touchpad is. It doesn't work. I find it less intuitive than just using the center point as a point of reference and going out from there. So it's not fun.
It doesn't work, but it's even worse when you're in CarPlay. Like, at least when you're in there in the Acura settings itself, it's a little better to touch the pad and to have it sort of in a area that is on the screen. But once you're in CarPlay, it just doesn't work at all.
So what's going on in the Palisade there for infotainment?
I love the infotainment in the Palisade. It's so easy to use. It makes a lot of sense. It's intuitive. Everything is easy to touch. I don't even mind the little touch climate controls here because they're so big that it makes it simple to use. I do like that the MDX has a wireless phone charger in there, and it's also got wireless Apple CarPlay, because then you can just throw your phone in there and charge it. Whereas in here, there is a wireless phone charger, but it's sort of pointless because you have to plug in to use Apple CarPlay, and once you're plugged in, you're charging. So you don't really need that area to charge your phone.
Exactly, and I'm not a fan at all of the fact that it's not wireless Apple CarPlay. I think when you're spending north of $50,000 on a vehicle at this point in automotive development, I think you're expecting to get that wireless CarPlay and Android Auto at this stage. So it's pretty disappointing that Hyundai hasn't incorporated that into its upper systems yet. The odd thing is, if you get in some Hyundai vehicles the smaller screen, that has wireless CarPlay and Android Auto, but the upgraded system doesn't. They really need to fix that. Coming back to your point about the climate control screen, though, that's one of the new things in the refresh with the Palisade, and I really like it. I don't normally like digital climate controls like that, but this one is, like you said, it's larger, it's nice to use, it's intuitive, and it doesn't get in the way at all, and it just adds a little element of sort of futuristic look and feel to the interior of the Palisade that wasn't there before.
It's like a slow progression as well, because it still has some buttons in here, making it just as usable as anything else, so it's not like it's all touch.
One last point I want to make about both of these vehicles, both of them are shift by button, and so the one in the Palisade is the same one that was in there before. It's the sort of chrome look plastic buttons, and it is what it is. It's not awesome, but it's a Hyundai, and so you kind of expect that. I want to dig into Acura a little bit here, because the push button gear selector that we have here in the MDX is the exact same one from the same parts bin as the Honda Odyssey, or other down market vehicles. And so Acura, I think they're working on this too, because again, the new Integra doesn't have this. It's got a different shifter entirely, but your luxury brand deserves better than the same thing you can get in a minivan. You know what I mean? So I'm hopeful that this is something that will go into development, maybe in a refresh in this generation of the MDX down the line.
I agree, and aside from them pulling it from Honda, as much as I don't like the buttons, I prefer like the actual shifter. The one in the Palisade, at least they're all large buttons that you can clearly see everything in. Yeah, you have to look down to double check that you're pressing the right thing, but at least they're all simple buttons, whereas I'm not a fan of the MDX's different setup. Like, if you're putting it into reverse, you have to sort of press the button down as opposed to just a normal button being there. Does that make sense?
It does. It's not very intuitive at all. So I think we've talked our way through these two vehicles. Are we ready to go back and make a verdict?
Yeah, let's head back to the parking lot. So Steph, what'd you think of these two SUVs?
This is a much tougher comparison than it was the first time around. I think where I land on it is that who we would recommend this vehicle to, each vehicle to, depends on their situation. They're both excellent three-row SUVs. If you're a family that's going to use the full capability of the Palisade with that third row that's more spacious and easier to use, then the Palisade is the one that we would lean toward, or I would lean toward. Whereas for me, as someone who loves to drive and would use the third row only occasionally, I'm going to change my vote from the first comparison, and I'm going to say the MDX is the one that I would choose. What do you think, Renita?
I completely agree with those points, Steph. I think that for me, I'm going to have to pick the Palisade, though. The inside had a few more family-friendly features than the Acura, but overall the drive was better in the Acura. I love the middle seat in the Acura, but again, it's going to be the Palisade for me. I guess we'll call it a draw on this one. They've both got really good features for both of us, and it'll really depend on your preferences.
That's right.
For Driving.ca, I'm Renita Narain.
And I'm Stephanie Wallcraft. For more comparisons and other features, follow us on social media or click the button below to subscribe. Now me, I'm getting back in the car. It's cold out here.